Radio, hosted by Pia Morato, is on Saturdays from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. on Teleradio Bandido, Channel 224 Sky Cable, TV Plus boxes, digital free-to-air Channel 29, Facebook.com/DZRJ 8:10 a.m., and YouTube channel RJAM News. This brings service to all educators and learners of every age. The program guests include secretaries, dignitaries, ambassadors, lawmakers, professors, volunteers, and heroes, all dedicated to contribute to this valuable advocacy. We take the streets to the classroom and the classroom to the streets.
Good morning, and we're back here on Education Radio with our very special guest, Ambassador Chito Santa Romana, the Philippine Chinese Ambassador. Good morning.
Good morning, Pia.
Good morning, Ambassador. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks. Thanks a lot.
So we'll begin with like a get to know first, and prior to this, everybody has been very excited about knowing what's been going on with the Philippines and China, and it's great to be hearing it live from you first, Ambassador Chito. You don't mind me calling you Ambassador Chito, do you?
No problem. That's fine.
So, Ambassador, tell us what and how did you get to where you are today? What were your humble beginnings?
Well, actually, I'm not a professional diplomat. I was, for a long time, a foreign journalist.
Oh, okay.
I worked for a news agency covering China. I worked for ABC News, which is based in New York.
Yeah.
And I was, like you, engaged in broadcast journalism. And I covered China for more than 20 years with ABC News. And I actually retired in 2010, and I went back to the Philippines, and I taught Chinese politics and foreign policy at the UP Center. I was also very much involved with Philippine Association for Chinese Studies, or PACS, PACS. I was the president at one point. So I was very much involved in the discourse, in the discussion about Philippines-China relations. And the reason President Duterte appointed me as the ambassador, you see, during the election, I was part of a small group of UP professors and teachers there that actually played a role as a non-partisan think tank, providing advice to all the presidential candidates. And that's how I got to meet President Duterte and his staff. But beyond that, after he won, I could sense that he was interested in a policy shift towards a friendlier, improving relations with China. And he named former President Ramos as a special envoy. And former President Ramos took me in as a special consultant and initiated what is known as the ice-breaking meetings in Hong Kong. This was August, after the election. Yeah. President Duterte was already in the office. And we had the first meetings with the Chinese officials, in which the basic foundation of what we now know as the current foreign policy was laid out. And so we briefed the president afterwards on the progress. And so the question was, what do we do next? And President Ramos says, you have to name an ambassador. And he asked me if I had any nominees. And I did. I nominated several professional diplomats. I said it should be a diplomat from the DFA with China experience, possibly speaking Chinese. And I knew most of them who had China experience, so I nominated a couple. At that time, because we went through a very confrontational approach, and an approach that led to the freezing of relations. The China post was not an attractive post for professional diplomats, you know.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, before me, there were two senior diplomats, female diplomats, who were appointed here one after another, and they both had to go home, you know, on a medical evacuation.
Wow.
They got sick while they were in China. So somehow the China Post acquired a reputation that not only is it difficult to deal with the Chinese, you could also get sick
In
and come
China?
home on a medical flight. So nobody wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But it was. And so eventually, President Ramos said, since you were there from the start and you know what the policy is, I'm going to nominate you to the president. And the president did his recommendation. And, you know, I was resisting at first because I said it should be a veteran diplomat. And at that point, I had some personal issues that I had to deal with. But in the end, the president said, you're hereby designated, and you know you don't say no to the president.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a chance to be able to serve the country and to be able to put my ideas
Right.
into practice. But that's how I became an ambassador. I think it helped that I was a journalist that covered China. I was based here for a couple of decades, and that I could speak the language, and that I was familiar with China and Chinese culture and the Chinese thinking.
Right.
So those are the sort of the advantages I bring with me
I agree.
in assuming this post. That was October 2016 when I was appointed. Then I was approved by the Commission on Appointments in December, and I finally assumed the position. I came to Beijing in the end of February 2017, and I presented my credentials to President Xi in March 2017. So this is, I'm doing actually now my fourth year. You know, I've done 3 years, and by March of next year, I'll have completed 4 years.
4 years.
And by the time the president, yes, and by the time the election comes around, I would have done 5 years. So hopefully by that time, you know, coterminous with the president, I'll be able to go back to my life as a retiree and go back to the Philippines and enjoy the life there.
You've lasted, Ambassador, almost 5 years.
Yes, I know. It helped that a feature or a signature feature of the Duterte administration is the shift in policy.
Yes.
Basically, we came up with this approach in which you put the disputes in one track,
Yes.
and you put the area where there are no disputes on another track.
Yes.
And so you can fast track the area where there are no disputes.
Yes.
And where there are disputes, you use diplomacy and the bilateral dialogue mechanism to discuss them. And it remains a challenge,
Yes.
but we're able to fast track on areas where there are no disputes.
Yes.
So because of that, life has been easier for me compared to my predecessors.
Yes. With the whole peace and development strategy, right?
Yes, and the Chinese have responded in a positive way. They have tried to help in every way they could, and now with the pandemic, a key approach now is, of course, the cooperation on the pandemic.
Right.
You know, as I mentioned in earlier interviews, the Chinese government has facilitated, you know, over 60 flights from the Philippine Air Force. The Philippine Air Force C-130 transport planes have been able to fly here and pick up medical supplies that were used and medical equipment for use in the Philippines, including testing for COVID, as well as PPEs and the like.
Yeah.
So this is currently the focus. and now we want to go into, we're having discussions on vaccine, because the Chinese are near. Actually, they're already in the phase 3
Yes.
of vaccine development.
Yes.
And our course is when the situation is ready, when the time comes to be able to procure this, and we have to prepare on the Philippine side. You
Right.
need like cold storage, a place where you can store the vaccine, because in the Philippine weather, you'd have to store it well.
Right. And we're talking vaccines, we're talking COVID. How are you coping, Ambassador? And the rest of the Filipinos in China?
Well, when the pandemic started here, and there was a lockdown in Wuhan in January, it was the time of the Chinese New Year. And on the day they declared a lockdown in Wuhan, or rather the day after, I was heading back to Manila for my Chinese New Year vacation. So I was actually in the Philippines for 2 weeks around that time. But then the plans started to evolve towards evacuating the Filipinos who were in Wuhan, those who wanted to be evacuated. Because, you see, there were about 150 in Wuhan city itself. And then another 150 outside the city, but within the province of Hubei, where the capital is Wuhan. And then we did a survey. There were at least 50 plus wanted to be evacuated. They were very scared. So the Philippine government decided that we should give them the option to be evacuated. So that's why the preparations were made for an evacuation flight. And that's why I came back on February 5th to supervise it together with the Shanghai consulate, who the Shanghai consulate, being the nearest consulate to Wuhan, was actually in the front line. They sent people to Wuhan. They were in touch with the Filipinos there. And so that went successfully. The other Filipinos, the main, actually in China during the height, January, February, up to March, basically we stayed indoors. I stayed in my residence, and the office is very close to the residence. Okay. It's in the same compound. I didn't go out. And at that point, I had very little contact with the outside world except through internet or television.
Yeah.
So that's how I was able to cope. But now the situation in Beijing, in China,
is
has
it
improved.
different? It's improved, yes.
Oh, different. There's since what? Since the middle of August, it's been zero local transmission of the virus. The cases reported, which is roughly a dozen or two a day, are all discovered at the airport.
Okay.
When these are Chinese coming back from abroad, or overseas Chinese coming back from abroad, or foreigners coming back to China, and they subject you to a swab test right away,
right,
and to a quarantine. So that's where the detection happens.
Yeah. But locally, no local transmissions.
Yeah, the last one in Beijing was June, actually, in a wholesale market here. But even then, they learned from the experience of Wuhan. Wuhan, the strategy was still total lockdown. By June, when they discovered the cluster in a market in Beijing, they employed a strategy of targeted lockdown. So we could go out near the embassy area, but there were certain areas, particularly near the market, that were under lockdown. But together with that, they employed the strategy of massive tracing and testing. Half of the city of Beijing actually had a swab test. Wow. So they were able to isolate right away. In Wuhan, the whole city afterwards, this was already afterwards, were subjected to a swab test because they wanted to show the other parts of China that Wuhan was COVID-free.
Right.
Because, nobody in Beijing or Shanghai or other cities wanted to accept the residents from Wuhan.
Yeah.
So Wuhan went on that campaign. Now that is the strategy they're employing. When they see a cluster, they targeted lockdown, do right away a tracing, and then the testing of not only the known contacts, but the proximate contacts, but practically those who live in a particular area. So that's how they're able to, in a sense,
it's pretty much granular.
How they're able to, yes, exactly, what we call the granular lockdown. But that's how they're able to, they're near the completion of phase 3 of the vaccine, but they don't have the vaccine yet deployed throughout the country. So what they're doing is that they're able to control the cluster or the infection, and they're able to open the economy. So they have maintained this balance. Now it's actually, we're going through this, they call it the Golden Week. These are the holidays, October 1 to 8. And the Chinese have been under lockdown for so long. They've been told not to move, not to travel. So now they are able to travel within China, and there is a boom. They're expecting like 600 million passengers taking the train, taking the airplanes.
That's just within China.
Within.
Yes.
The problem is, international travel is not encouraged at this point.
Right.
Because of the pandemic.
Right.
And it's very difficult to go abroad or for outside China, for those outside China, even in the Philippines. That's why I haven't been able to go home since February. It's just so difficult. Quarantine protocols, the health protocols, and the price of the ticket.
Right.
If ever there's a flight, expensive.
It's going to be expensive.
So in China right now, the domestic tourism is starting to boom.
Yes.
Domestic travel, and then the catering, the restaurants have opened, and movie theaters have opened, but it's like 50%. Every other seat only is allowed to be used, and there are restrictions for museums, for the tourist sites, 75% only capacity. But nevertheless, if you look at the photos that have come out on state media, the train stations are full of people.
Full, they're packed.
So I hope there won't be any cluster after this.
Oh my gosh, I hope not. Me too.
So this is a real... Yeah, we'll see what happens in the next 2 weeks. Hopefully there won't be any new clusters. If they can pass through this period without new clusters, it would be quite a test, or quite a feat, actually. So that's the situation here. It's almost normal. I mean, we still use a mask, particularly if you're in the outside or in a store, or in an airplane. I went to Xiamen more than 2 weeks ago to represent the Philippines in a international trade. It's an international fair for investment and trade. And of course, the plane was full, and when we arrived in Xiamen has actually even done better. Right. It's almost 200 days that they're COVID-free. So there, the moment you land, you feel like it's a different world altogether. I mean, they still take precautions. In the beginning, we were told you can take off your mask, but no handshake. But by the second or third day, all that had gone out of the window. People were shaking hands and visiting the fair and so on. So that's the situation right now over here.
And so while we're waiting for the vaccine, where in our interview in the Philippine Star, I clearly remember the Philippines is part of the China plan, when it comes to the vaccine. And
there is a priority list. This was already as far back as, I believe, during the conversation between President Xi and President Duterte. They agreed that the Philippines would be the priority list. The list has now expanded, I think, to all of ASEAN
Right.
and a number of other countries. But we're definitely there. And the question now is for the Philippines to prepare, because I think the Chinese, they're now finishing their phase 3, and they're preparing to deploy the vaccine by November, December,
Yeah.
certainly by the first quarter of next year.
Right.
And there's already some talk that they'll be manufacturing it and starting November for mass production. So we're near that stage, and I think the question now is really just to wait for they're going to publish the results of the phase 3 in a peer-reviewed journal submitted to the international community. And then in the case of the Philippines, to go through all the requirements before the vaccine use. So we're near that stage.
Well, there's also another interesting thing where you had also mentioned, also actually Ambassador Huang mentioned it, how there's, the China has the Wuhan experience, and so hence with that, the Filipinos really also gain from that experience.
Yes, actually, remember there was a medicine from China that was sent to the Philippines. I believe this was March or April. And they had their discussions with their counterparts. And most of the doctors, if not all, they came from another province, Fujian. But they were sent by Fujian province to Wuhan to help during the pandemic. So they all gained the experience and the lessons from Wuhan, and that's what they were trying to impart to the Philippines, to that experience.
Right.
Of course, in China, it's difficult, They were able to do it because the government poured people. It was a whole society approach. They called it a people's war.
Yes.
So everybody contributed, and they poured a lot of resources, and it also helped that the Chinese, because the mass media really did a good job in terms of inculcating them and also in showing the risk involved. The Chinese people responded, let's say, more obediently, and the cooperation went very well between the government and the people. It was a tough experience, but from that they were able to come up with their particular strategy that they refined to what is now being employed, or what was subsequently employed in Beijing, in other places where clusters developed a more targeted approach, because Wuhan they used a very drastic approach. It was the initial experience, but from there they refined it further. But the key, of course, is mass testing, mass tracing, and targeted lockdown. It's easier said than done, but it takes a lot of resources.
Right.
And that is the challenge.
I'm sure. But our kapwa Filipinos, how are they? I know they're almost back to normal.
Well, there's a significant group of Filipinos who are here, are teachers, English teachers. They teach, in different levels, particularly at the elementary and nursery school level, or kindergarten. Of course, at that point, schools were closed, and some of these teachers were paid on you come, no work, no pay.
Right.
You work, you are only paid if you work. So there were at that point we had to distribute food packages to help out the Filipinos, particularly the teachers or those who worked also in restaurants or hotels that all closed down. So because of this, part of it was to help them to be able to make ends meet and to make sure they're at least fed or had food supplies. And aside from that, the government did authorize us to issue what the same as in the Philippines, a certain amount of money just to help them make ends meet. We also try to help a number of Filipinos because, they had to continue paying rent.
Yes.
Even though they were being paid. So it was tough. So there were some negotiations done together with the help of Chinese authorities to at least suspend or to lower the rent. But beyond that, it unfortunately, because of the closure of some businesses and the closure of some restaurants, even some schools, quite a number of Filipinos were affected. And that's why we had to organize the repatriation flights. We were able to organize all over China, the different consulates. In Shanghai, they were able to organize one. There was a big group there. Guangzhou also had a big group in South China. The same with in Beijing, we were able to have a separate flight. And the situation now has changed. Schools have reopened, so the teachers are in good condition. Businesses are reopening, so the people who for a while were not getting paid are now back to work. There are two types of problems now that has manifested itself in the Philippine community here. One is it's actually not Filipinos who are living in China, but rather they're working aboard boats that are owned by Chinese companies or have been purchased by Chinese companies, and now they're docked. They're come back to China and they're docked, and because of the danger of COVID, they're not allowed to disembark. So there's a lot of negotiations going on with the authorities to allow them to disembark, go through the quarantine or the swab test, and then to organize repatriation flight to bring them back to the Philippines. So that's one type of work that we're doing. It's been done times. The most recent one in Xiamen, in Fujian, where there were like 11 fishermen who were on a boat for almost 6 months. They weren't allowed to get off. And it was really tough on both physically, mentally, but finally they made it back home. And as well as several seafarers.
Right.
So that's one group. The second group now actually are Filipinos who have jobs in China, but left China during the Chinese New Year in January, were locked out of the country, and they're in the Philippines, and now they want to come back. And the problem, the lack of flights, direct flights or low-cost flights, you have to pay like 100,000 peso for an economy one-way ticket to come to China. So they want to be able to, they need help in terms of chartering at a low cost. So those are the two types of problems we're dealing with right now.
You have a lot on your hands, Ambassador.
Fortunately, the number of COVID cases among the Filipino community has been quite low. At most, we have had reports of around 20, and most of them have already recovered because the moment it's detected, they are treated in a Chinese, they're given proper medical treatment, and usually their employers pay for their care, and in where there is nobody paying for their care, the Chinese government actually also helps out. So we've been able to manage the situation, and the prospects right now are improving in terms of moving forward over here.
Yes, okay. Ambassador, we'll just pause for a break. We'll be right back here on Education Radio. Stay tuned.
UGM, Ugnayang Gobyerno at Mamamayan, ang programa.
Good morning, and we're back here on Education Radio with Ambassador Santa Romana. So, Ambassador, all the ambassadors, either I call them Your Excellency, or sometimes because they're my friends, I call them Amba. Right, on Facebook, and people don't seem to understand that being an ambassador sometimes is really also about being everybody's friend, right? You're like the BFF representative of this country for China. And so you have like a huge task at hand. And before we went on air, we were saying that, wow, ambassador, you know, you're 5 years there. It's exciting for you, right? and the weather, it's cold, right? So you have a lot on your hands, ambassador.
Yeah, it keeps me busy. But I have you have a corps of foreign service officers that assist me, and they're a very professional group. So they really do the heavy lifting. Mine is really the strategic direction and the overall supervision. And then you have staff, foreign service staff, that were sent here by Manila, and they run the embassy on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
I do most of the representation work and negotiation work, but yeah, it keeps one busy.
Yeah. Well, most recently, China also celebrated it was like our Filipino-Chinese Friendship Day. That was very recent.
And also, that was actually last June, and it was also the anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations, the 45th anniversary since 1975, actually. Although relations with China contacts with China go back 1,000 years.
1,000 years.
Before, you know, in the Song Dynasty.
Something we love to talk about on Education Radio is heritage.
There is an imperial sort of a diary that records the first contacts between the Philippines and China when we were first mentioned. At that point, of course, at that point there was no Philippines yet, so they were mentioning Luzon, you know, in the Chinese name for Luzon, and Mindoro, and so on. So it goes back. The recorded history shows that.
And you speak the language fluently, right? I mean, you speak Mandarin.
Yeah, I actually, when I was much younger, of course, I enrolled here. I studied Mandarin for, and so that helps. Mandarin is a very challenging language, Chinese in general, and it helped. And of course, all the years that I stayed here, so that helps in terms of being able to understand what they're saying, speaking directly to them, and to be. I mean, I won't get lost in Beijing. I can ask for the Chinese city and ask for direction on where to go. So that helps because the first problem for any foreigner here is really the cultural shock. It's so different from the Philippines, the Western world, Western civilization that we're used to. But it helps to understand it because then you understand the way they think, the way they behave, and it's also part of our own upbringing. I mean, our own race, our own culture, because it's very much intermingled with the Chinese culture. So you get to know yourself better while trying to understand better. That's true. Also the distinction, because we're a combination of Western and Eastern civilization. So in that sense, it's very interesting in that sense.
Which leads me to wanting to really talk about our bananas. Okay. Since
the Chinese love them. They see the water different, the sweetness, the flavor. We compete very strongly with I believe it's Ecuador, Central American bananas. But because of the distance, the transportation factor, we have an advantage also price-wise because we're quite near. So and the quality, it's it's different. The Cavendish
Yeah. Oh,
bananas.
okay. So it's good that
What
you
we're
say
trying-
that, because people were saying, which banana? The small one, the big one? What kind of bananas? I'm so interested with this 600 million bananas.
As a matter of fact, you see it only, I think, in some supermarkets or the malls, and they're the long ones.
Yes. Those are my favorite
with
ones,
hardly any-
actually.
It's like picture perfect, no spots. That's what they sell here. Walking in Beijing or anywhere in China. I mean, what, 600 million, 800? There are hundreds of millions of dollars worth of bananas per year. We actually, the Philippines, we're the number one in terms of source of bananas. But the Latin America, particularly Central America, Ecuador and other countries are trying to catch up. And Vietnam.
In Vietnam.
And Thailand too. But the quality is not quite the same. Now, we want to, aside from Cavendish bananas, we want to introduce the other varieties,
Yeah.
Taba, the different types that we know.
Yeah.
You have to go through a very strict process of approval process. So we have a full-time agricultural counselor who's doing that. This year, she managed to get approval for what we call the avocados, the hash avocado. It's not the regular avocado we have in the market, the long one, purple one. This one is smaller, greenish, purplish. It's closer to the Mexican avocado, which the Chinese prefer, for salads, for mixture of goods, for mixing in their food. And of course, next to bananas, the other fruit that is growing real fast in terms of sales and volume is pineapples. So it's really, and then it's newly approved. I think it's only been a year or so. Before there was a ban on young coconuts, fresh coconut to be imported to China. It was considered, we were considering it before, it's like a state secret, nobody should smuggle them. But now they have rules for a certain type of young coconut that can be imported into the country. The Chinese drink a lot of cocoa water.
Yeah.
And that is one booming market here. If we could supply more cocoa water, they would take a lot of it, but I'm afraid it would entail all the coconut trees in the Philippines because of the volume.
The volume.
So we can at least to occupy a big share of the market.
Yeah.
Because this China is just so big that it would take several Philippines to be able to satisfy
That's true.
the demand.
So, Ambassador, since the visit of President Duterte to China in 2016, we all know, and you were there already, that the ties between the Philippines and China really blossomed. And in fact, like international import and expo, I think these are summits. We're often joining these things, right? And we've been participating for the past 2 years. So we're talking about trade and we're talking about imports and exports, and it seems now like we're going from bananas to coconuts, right? But and volume wise, there's so much to give because they want so much from our produce.
There is a big demand. Now there's a big demand for seafood, shrimps.
Wow.
There's a big demand. Actually, they're very much interested in a Chinese restaurant in China, in Beijing, even Hong Kong. The most expensive fish that is for sale is a kind of garupa. They call it the tiger garupa, which is actually very close to our lapu-lapu. It's the same family.
Okay.
So they'd very much like to have that
Lapu-lapu
kind of fish
now.
here. But again,
Wow, that's interesting. Okay, that's
and
interesting.
actually, the story when they grow that type of fish, they grow it in waters of Hainan or South China. It comes out brownish. But the same variety, if grown in the waters in Palawan or the Visayas or Mindanao, it comes out reddish. Because Chinese, the offshore waters are basically polluted already or depleted of seafood of fishes. So, and they're into what they call using cages for fishing. So they very much they import a lot of seafood. The same with shrimps. The same with lobsters. So there is a big demand. And there are other products that they're looking for, other types of actually they were asking because they import a lot from Malaysia, from Thailand. It's durian,
Durian.
The Chinese have acquired.
Okay.
But in the Philippines, it's only grown in Mindanao, and I think we can only satisfy a certain type of market. But apparently there are different types and different quality. But there have been inquiries about that because somehow it's something that's they've acquired a taste for making cakes. I mean, some of them can eat it fresh, but it's usually mixed together in cakes or ice cream or dessert and so on. So it's interesting. The whole range of tropical fruits. But actually, the biggest trade item still between the Philippines and China, believe it or not, is still the semi-processed electronic products. We're part of a supply chain. The Philippines would export to China, it would be processed here, and it would be sent either to Japan or Germany, and then part of a supply chain that supplies the world, basically, for electronic products. So because of that, it still occupies a big portion of the trade. But what we need to do, actually, is to have and the whole pursuit is to have more value-added products.
Yeah.
Instead of just pineapples, canned pineapples, instead of bananas. Eventually, if there are canned bananas or whatever. But you see, it is very, you have to transport them at the right time so that they arrive in China and they ripen here at the right time so that when the consumers go to they're just about turning yellow and so on.
Yeah.
So it's very, the quality control is very demanding. But there's definitely a big demand for that. The other aspect where the Philippines wants to get into, and I this because we participated in this recent trade fair, is the whole market of services.
Yes, that was what I was going to ask next.
Software, teaching. One boom market right now is online education, particularly English. It's amazing. There's actually, and you can see it because there is a big demand here for teachers to learn English, and there's actually an agreement between the Philippines and China to hire 2,000 Filipino teachers to teach English at the university level. And this has been affected, of course, by the pandemic. So it still has to be implemented fully, but there are already some that came over. But what is booming is learning English at the high school or elementary level, and it is booming online.
Yeah.
And an example of this, a Chinese entrepreneur was able to set up in the Philippines. It's called 51 Talk.
Yeah, 51 Talk. Okay.
51 Talk, yes. The reason is it's called 51 Talk because if you translate 51 into Chinese, it sounds like the saying I want to talk, or
I didn't know
51 in Chinese.
Okay.
Talk. So that's why they changed the number. But they started there about a couple of years back, even before. 2012, 2013, but it really boomed in recent years. And now they've hired about 20,000 Filipino teachers. A lot of them came from the BPO. You know, in BPO, they service the international customers and they work at night to service somebody. Now, they're offered the same amount of money or even more, and they teach somebody in China on the same dateline, so to speak, same daytime. And particularly these are kids, so they prefer morning. So there's like a schedule, you know. You can choose which teacher you want, which day. Here is the rate. And it's selling like hotcakes here, so much so that actually the teachers and the students have bonded and have formed friendships, so that it blossomed into also tourism. You know, the students organize tour groups. They come to the Philippines to be able to meet their teachers.
Yeah.
So it's kind of
like a whole cultural exchange already.
And the advantage is that for the Filipinos, in a sense, you don't become an OFW. You stay right in the Philippines and teach and earn good money teaching young Chinese here, Chinese children actually. And their parents, of course, are willing to pay for the education of the kids, so that this would be a ticket to the future. So there's this whole market that's developed, and they plan to expand this further. They're talking in terms of expanding it, 3, 4, 5-fold, as many as 100,000 teachers in the Philippines, teaching 1 million kids here.
Can imagine.
So we're talking here.
Yeah.
That is interesting. Well, because China is, the biggest growing consumer market, and this is one area in the sector that is certainly booming.
Right. One of the other things, Ambassador, is that what we want to understand about why, the Philippines and China really should, look into this closeness of our relationship are certain factors such as our geography. Let's talk about being neighbors, right? And how, as neighbors, we are able to deal with whatever issues that we have, and also move forward with, progress, in terms of progress.
Exactly. There is a saying, you can choose your friends, but you cannot choose your neighbors. By dint of geography, we are just separated by the South China Sea, China and the Philippines. However, as neighbors, you have to learn to live with each other and certainly to coexist and try to improve the relationship. The last thing you want is a hostile neighborhood. The last thing you want is a hostile relationship with a neighbor. And not only that, it turns out that China too is the second largest economy in the world, and it's the biggest growing consumer market. So there are a lot of reasons why you have to be able to live and cooperate with each other, because in a sense, your economic, cultural destiny are very much tied by dint of geography, by dint of culture, and you can then turn your geography into an advantage. Of course, we have a lot of Filipinos in the U.S., but it's just that it's so far. We can still maintain the traditional ties, but we have to focus more on Asia. And in Asia, our biggest neighbor is China.
Right.
Of course, there are other neighbors that we have to deal with. That's why we speak of ASEAN and ASEAN centrality and having good relations with all our Asian neighbors. So a more inclusive approach is what is behind our current foreign policy. And we start primarily with neighboring countries, because as the saying goes, a distant relative, or rather a close neighbor, can be better than a distant relative simply because it's right next door. And in times of need, you may need help.
Right. You know, I really like the way you think, Ambassador. I mean, in AIM, I learned that how, you know, the Chinese look at it. There's a symbol that stands both for crisis and opportunity, right? And you know this. And since then, I'm always like looking for opportunities in times of crisis, right? Because it's there.
Exactly.
And I see that this is the attitude that you have also in you, and it's part of our heritage, right? And then if the Chinese are that way, this is also something that I can see that you are adapting to. It's also part of who you are and your heritage. I'm sure that there have been circumstances here in China, and you relayed them to earlier, that put you in that position where you have to really get something good out of something that's not so good. Right?
Well, exactly. The Chinese, actually, that is one advantage in knowing the Chinese mindset, because there is a lot of that. I mean, you know, you turn a bad thing into a good thing. A crisis can be an opportunity, you know, or in the Western world, you know, we say, you know, find the silver lining, you know, in the storm, and so on. So it's that type of thinking, that for everything there are two sides in everything. There's the positive, the negative, but you can turn it into you know, you can maximize the positive if you're able to handle it well, and avoid turning it into something really very negative if you don't handle it well. It's the same with disputes. You know, if you handle it well, you'll be able to make sure that the disputes do not get in the way of the friendship and the good relations. If you mishandle it, and if you blow it out of proportion, then it could destroy the whole friendship and become the actual stumbling block. So the basic mission, or the basic task, I think, of diplomacy right now is, it's easy to be a diplomat in a country where you agree on everything. But the challenge is to employ diplomacy in a country where you have differences. Now, of course, it's almost impossible that in one country everything is made up of differences. There are differences and there are convergences. It's really how to be able to manage the differences so that you maximize the interests that are convergent. And this, I think, is the task at hand, and the basic way to move forward. Because also by dint of geography, since we're neighbors, there is a body of water that we share, or you know, that order. And because of that, all these maritime features that become problematic, you know, as you try to apply international law, or you know, the whole history of the dispute. So because of that, it's really a matter of approach. If you emphasize conflict or confrontation, the result will be more confrontation. If you emphasize cooperation, or you handle the balance between the two, and you put cooperation as the principal aspect, then you can move forward. And it's easier to actually handle the issues that divide you, because you can at least talk to each other in a better way, more amicable way. It's how to have differences without being disagreeable.
Right.
You know,
I agree.
that's key.
If friends can do it, neighbors must do it as well.
Yeah.
So my last question for you, Ambassador, is what is the thing that you miss most in the Philippines, since you haven't been home?
Well, of course, my family is there. My wife is there. She's actually, I see through technology though, through Zoom or we WeChat as we use it, I'm able to talk to my son and my wife who's there. But what I miss most really is, that's home. I mean, of course, this is a job for me, but it's like a second home. But the Philippines, you what you want to eat, your friends, your classmates, it's still that whole social network that we know as home, as community, as family, that I miss most. Through technology, we're able to overcome the distance, and it helps a lot, like through Zoom. But it's different, it's different. And as the saying goes, there's no other place like home.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for the time, Ambassador. It was great talking to you. I look forward to one day meeting you in person and talk more. As fellow as fellow heritage lovers and journalists, I'm sure I have a lot to learn from you too.
Well, it goes both ways, and thanks for having me and for having this opportunity to exchange views with you. Good questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
I like that. Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you so much for tuning in on Education Radio here on DZRJ 810 AM. This has been Pia Morato. Hasta luego, everyone.